Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
Brian Chasnoff, investigative reporter.
And this happens to be the 100th episode of the Puro Politics podcast. We did our first one May 3rd in 2018. And knowing that we were coming up to the 100th episode, I went back and listened a little bit to see what we were talking about on the first one. And in that very first episode, I think the main topic of conversation was the issue of whether San Antonio should have put in a bid for the Republican National Convention in 2020. And 2 years later, there's a question as to whether there will be an actual Republican convention, whether people will actually be able to meet because of COVID-19. And Donald Trump still wants to have a real convention versus a virtual one. And because he's had some issues with Charlotte, North Carolina, and concerns they've had about social distancing, he's actually talked about moving it. And we've had the Texas Republican Party saying, "Bring it here if you can't work things out in Charlotte." So 2 years after we started the podcast, there was still some question about whether the Republican convention will be in Texas. But the big story,
how things don't change.
It's really amazing. Wow. And this has been one of the most trying years in recent American history. We've had a public health crisis with COVID-19, which has resulted in an economic collapse, the likes of which we haven't seen in more than 80 years. And we're also going through a level of social unrest now, and this has been a recent development that we haven't seen in a while. And it was sparked by an incident last week in Minneapolis, where a Houston native who was in Minneapolis named George Floyd was arrested, and the police officer put his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, and George Floyd died as a result. And this is the latest in a long line of incidents of police brutality, where we've seen people who have died at the hands of police officers, or in the case of Trayvon Martin in Florida years ago, killed by a vigilante who apparently targeted him just because he was a young black man. So the George Floyd killing has sparked protests all over the country for the past week. Saturday night, we saw one in San Antonio. It was a really peaceful protest. And I think after the gathering had really sort of, a lot of the people had left, and the protest had really sort of ended. You still had a lot of people downtown, and you started to have a situation where there were people smashing windows of downtown businesses, particularly on Houston Street, and some looting going on. There were a few people arrested. And this is a pattern. I mean, it seems like in many cities, we had sort of like late afternoon protests that have been very peaceful and very high-minded. And then when it gets later at night, you'll see like some vandalism or, buildings being burned. And sometimes the protesters are trying to urge the people who are committing the acts of vandalism and trying to get them to stop it. And there are questions about, are these people coming from out of town? Are white nationalists coming in trying to sabotage the events? So it's gotten very complicated. And Brian, I was thinking about how much you've covered police issues over the year, and you've written about police misconduct in San Antonio more than anyone I can think of. When you look at what happened with George Floyd, because this is not simply a case of one bad cop. I mean, there were 3 cops who were there and allowed this to happen, and this seems to keep happening in different cities. When you look at the systemic problems that we have with law enforcement in this country, particularly when dealing with people of color, what do you see as the things that need to change?
Well, I mean, you hear some people say it's just a few bad apples, but there's a clearly a larger problem than just that.
Right.
And I think you can it starts to come into focus when you think about the motivations for some of these police officers who feel they can behave in this way. I think that they feel protected, and they feel like there will be no consequences for it. That it's just it's part of the culture. A lot of what I've covered has been when there are instances of police misconduct, following that case forward to see whether the officer is charged or at least fired from the force, right?
Right.
And I think what we've seen again and again locally is that the police union that
Hmm.
they have the capacity to uh, move these cases to arbitration, and the majority of cases are overturned after the police chief terminates the officer, and the officer is reinstated to the force. So that's what I mean by uh, the officers feel that systemically they are protected, and there might not be consequences for this awful behavior.
Yeah, and I think that the police union issue is a really big one because I think that there needs to be a reckoning both in the way that cities negotiate their police contract, and also I think the police unions and their leadership really need to be called out, and I think that they need to, there needs to be a lot of self examination, and I don't know if that's going to happen, but the police union mentality in some cities, I'm not going to say this is always the case, but in many cases the thinking is that the role of the union is to always look out for the officers, to always have their back in every situation, and to try to get the best deal they can for them if there is a question about police misconduct. And it should be in the interest of the union to want to remove people who are not serving in the right way. But that is often not the case, and there I think is often the thinking that if someone's
Yeah.
paying union dues, we have to look out for them, and we have to, and
Well, look at
that
the
yeah,
consequences for police across the country. Um, look at how they're suffering now. In some ways, because of the actions of one officer in Minneapolis. I mean, you're seeing. I mean, you're seeing suffering on both sides, but there are police officers who are getting injured as well in these protests and these riots that are. I think we had three San Antonio police officers who were injured on Saturday night from projectiles. Nothing too
yeah.
serious, but I mean, my point is just that by protecting officers at all costs, that there can be ripple effects where it ends up hurting more officers in the long run.
Yeah, bad cops are putting good cops in danger, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely right. And I think that one of the things that our former mayor, Julian Castro, who ran for president in 2020, has talked about, and police reform was a big part of his platform in his presidential campaign. He's talked about the issue of qualified immunity, which I think basically provides government officials with some protection from lawsuits and that sort of thing. And this is a kind of become a big issue recently. And I think the thinking is from him and from some others is that if police officers don't have that kind of protection as well, that can change police contact. Is this something you've heard people talk about a little bit?
I hadn't heard that specific issue, no, but it sounds interesting for sure.
Yeah, I think when we're looking going forward, I mean, there has to be an emphasis on improved training, which I think we have seen in some cities. Definitely, weeding out officers who have a history of this kind of record, and also eliminating this kind of situation where when an officer goes from one police department, gets in trouble and then goes somewhere else. That I think has to end.
Right. Yeah. I wrote a couple columns back in 2018, I think, about a Bear County deputy who had posted some racist stuff on Facebook,
Right.
and he was suspended while they investigated the situation, but that he was ultimately never terminated for those posts. And so you have to wonder if there needs to be if we need a greater level of accountability just in the expressions and the belief systems of people who are hired to serve and protect.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still learning a lot about what's happening with the protests because, like I said, the protests that we've seen in most cities have been, basically gatherings of people who wanted to, just have their voices heard on the issue of police reform and criminal justice. And then in some of these cases, they're kind of being sort of taken over by people who, in some instances, don't seem to even be that connected to the protests themselves.
Yeah,
And
you've
yeah.
seen authorities across the country blaming most of the looting and the rioting and the arson on so-called violent extremists.
Hmm.
Of course, the big question right now is which extremists, because
Hmm.
that runs the gamut from uh, left wing organizations, and I use the word organization loosely because a lot of these people, that it's very decentralized.
Yeah.
And then you have concerns about white supremacists and groups that are trying to foment racial tension. I
Right.
don't think there's a lot of clarity right now on who these people are, but I think that there's a growing consensus that a lot of the worst behavior that we've seen over the last few days has been very intentional, and is coming from folks who don't necessarily reside in the cities in which they're occurring.
Yeah, and the bad side of this is not only that you're seeing destruction and businesses being damaged and that sort of thing, but also it's sort of allowed people who maybe don't want to deal with the real issue here, which is police reform, to kind of divert attention away from that and to focus on the problems with the protests. And um, there was one really interesting video clip I saw of a protest in Nashville where there was a young white kid who I don't know if he had knocked something over or damaged something, and a kind of middle aged black man was scolding him and saying, you know, we're going to get blamed for this. This is we're it's going to come back on people in the black community, and he was basically just telling him you're being really irresponsible and just damaging stuff because you think it's fun or something. And it's really something that people in the black community are going to have to pay for. And I think that's what's made this whole situation really complicated, because there's so many different there's some people who are uh, acting out of anger. There's some people who are just kids who are just smashing things up because it seems like the thing to do in the moment. And you just have a lot of sort of uh, a lot of confusion, I think, going
And
on right now.
you can't deny the impact of the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic. I mean, you've got so many people out of work right now.
Right.
I'm sure that there's frustration and desperation boiling over, and just feelings of grief and despair. It's a it's a perfect storm.
Yeah, it is. Well, on the issue of the pandemic, you and Tom Osborne have been writing about the issue surrounding a local event planning company that's got a $39 million government contract to provide food relief. And it's been a pretty amazing story to see this unfold. And you all had one this weekend looking at the caterer, who I guess is like a partner of the event planner. What did you all discover in this story?
Yeah, well, first I got to give a shout out to Tom Osborne, who laid the groundwork for
Right.
this Sunday story. He's
He's done a
been
great job.
all
Yeah.
over this for weeks, and I kind of swooped in with just one piece of it. But Tom's been great to work with, and the piece that I contributed was just further questions about the chef who is a partner in this venture.
Hmm.
His name's Iverson Brownell. Apparently, Brownell is the one who persuaded Gregorio Palomino, the owner of Create a Date, to bid on this contract in the first
Mm.
place with USDA. And the contract is to provide food to needy families. They box food, hundreds of thousands of boxes distributed to families across many states. I think Arkansas, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas. It's a big undertaking, and the immediate concern was that this group Create a Date. It's an event planning company that had no experience in food distribution, and so the questions were, how did they win this contract, and how are they going to pull this off?
Right.
and Palomino had inflated and it sometimes completely invented business credentials and professional affiliations. And Tom did a great job
Mm-hmm.
of uncovering all that. I discovered a lot of the same kind of stuff with the chef who had, he posted online a bio of his career that contained a lot of embellishments. For example, he said he was selected by an Olympic committee to the
Right.
USOC to be the head chef for the House at the 2004 Olympic Games in Athens, Greece. And when in fact he was there, but he was a sous chef. He was one of many chefs who were part of this
Yeah.
large coalition of hundreds of chefs and caterers who were doing that job. And there were about four, five, six other examples of the same thing where he was involved in projects, but he later on went to just inflated his role. Saying he
Right.
created a show on ESPN called Offshore Adventures when he was actually just hired to be a chef for a couple years on the show. Years after it was created, things
Wow.
like that, and it just raises more red flags about honesty, and how they represented themselves in this bid, and whether or not they're trustworthy business partners. And in addition, this chef had gone bankrupt in 2011. He owed nearly $400,000 to a variety of creditors after his previous catering company, basically went under. So
How, did the chef respond, or how did he respond to what you?
he wouldn't talk to me on the phone, but I emailed some questions over, and his responses were basically to acknowledge. He didn't acknowledge the exaggerations in the bio, but in his answers, he explained and described his actual roles on these projects.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I asked him, well, why does your online bio and resume differ from what you're sending me now? And he never
Hmm.
adequately answered that question.
Where does that leave this $39 million contract? Are they in danger of losing it, or is it is
Well,
it too late for that? Or
you've got a variety of congressmen calling for investigations. I mean, Lloyd Doggett and Joaquin Castro have both are urging authorities to look into, whether or not there was something rotten behind this deal. But they've still got the contract now. There have been other fishy contracts that have been canceled by
mm-hmm.
the USDA. This one has not. This one
Mm-hmm.
is going forward, and I think, and I'm going to get this number wrong, but I mean it's hundreds of thousands of boxes that they have to deliver, and I think
Yeah.
they've delivered about 500 at this point, and they've only got
Wow.
4 or 5 weeks left to pull this off. So
Yeah, it's just one of those. It's a great story, and it's one of those that just really, I think, makes the public realize that sometimes the process by which these contracts are handed out is really questionable, and if you don't have people like Tom and you looking into this, I mean, it's amazing that
yeah,
these individuals had these kind of problems, and
I mean a lot is at stake. I mean
yeah,
you've got people, you've got so many people out of work, and people are starving.
yeah,
You know,
it's life and
I
death.
mean,
This is a
yeah,
life and death issue, absolutely. Well, before we wrap things up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Bexar County Republican Party chair, Cynthia Brem, and this is relates to something that happened about a week and a half ago. We didn't have a chance to talk about it last week. Cynthia Brem has had all kinds of issues during her 2 years in office. She people will remember has accused the county elections office of vote tampering. She threatened to pull out of the joint primary which the county has with the Democratic and Republican parties. She has had all kinds of internal disputes with people involved in her party. And a week and a half ago, she and 8 of her supporters had a press conference at City Hall, outside City Hall, and she basically said that the COVID-19 pandemic is something that's been kind of if not created, something that's been sort of inflated by Democrats who are trying to bring down Donald Trump. And she urged everyone, so take off your masks and express your freedom. And she was kind of attacking Mayor Nirenberg and County Judge Wolf for social distancing restrictions that they put in place. The thing that was really strange about this is that Greg Abbott, the governor, weeks ago, put out an executive order which specifically dealt with the issue of masks and said that he recommended that people wear masks but didn't require it. And that order superseded any municipal orders. And I think 3 days before her press conference, both Nelson Wolf and Ron Nirenberg put out new executive orders making it clear that there was no requirement to wear masks, but they recommended that people do this. So basically, they're in line with the governor. The governor has said repeatedly that if you can't be at least 6 feet apart from other people, that you should wear a mask in public. But she didn't attack him. She attacked the mayor and the county judge, and not only said that she thinks people should have the right to not wear masks, but urged them to take off their masks. Brian, you've covered her over the years. We've both written about her. I mean, this was really interesting because this actually got national attention. It went viral, and I think it sort of made her, for a lot of people, kind of the poster child of COVID-19 irresponsibility. I mean, what did you make of that?
Well, first of all, my favorite part of that clip was when, after Cynthia Brim spoke, you saw perennial Republican candidate Weston Martinez
Yes.
come over and embrace City Council gadfly Jack M. Finger. And it's just like the opposite of what folks should be doing at this point in terms of public health. You know, I mean, it's just, and it just strikes me as mindless in a way. To not take these precautions, and but above that, it's just selfish. You know, wearing a mask is not necessarily even to protect you from catching the virus. It's so that you don't infect others. And there's just we don't know a lot about the virus. We don't know a lot, but one thing we do know is that there's a large proportion of people who are infected who have no symptoms. And I don't know how many times people have to hear that, but that, coupled with the fact that respiratory droplets are the main way that it's transmitted, that just leads you to conclude unequivocally that if you put on a mask, you could be saving someone's life, near you. And so to me, it's just mindless and selfish to tell people not to wear a mask.
Yeah, and I think that this was clearly a campaign event. She's got a runoff, a very tough runoff against a local real estate appraiser named John Austin. And I think she was, people have been limited in how they've been able to campaign with social distancing. And this was kind of a campaign event for her. Since she's had that press conference, the two candidates who did not make the runoff have both endorsed John Austin. So it's basically, you got the three opponents that she had in the primary are now all kind of united against Cynthia Brim. And the last thing I wanted to mention on this, because I wanted to tie it back to our very first podcast. In that first podcast that we did in 2018, we not only talked about San Antonio not bidding on the Republican National Convention, but that very day, County Commissioner Tommy Calvert had a press conference in which he said that he opposed San Antonio bidding on the convention. And at that press conference, as soon as he concluded the press conference at the county courthouse, Cynthia Brim and Weston Martinez, the two people you mentioned, got up and wanted to kind of do the press conference of their own, and the mics had been turned off. And they later complained to the local media that their First Amendment rights had been abridged because they weren't allowed to sort of hop onto this press take that a county commissioner had and be able to use the mics there and take advantage of the press audience that he had, because, of course they could have had their own press conference, and I don't know if three people would have shown up, but they decided they wanted to be able to, when they had members of the press there. They wanted to be able to go in there and speak in favor of the Republican convention. So it's kind of all coming back full circle. And as you pointed out,
again, like how things, just don't change in 2 years. I mean, they say that political time is a lot longer than normal time, right? But
yeah. and if Cynthia Brem is going to have a public event, we never know what is going to come out of that, but I think we can always be sure that Weston Martinez is going to be like a few feet away. So that I think I can say that with confidence.
He's enjoying
so we're going to wrap it up on that note. I want to thank everyone who's been listening to the podcast over these 100 episodes over the past 2 years. We really appreciate it, and we love hearing your feedback, and hope everybody's staying safe and well, and we'll catch up with you next week. Take care.